All right, good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our next Wonk Wednesday event put on by the University of Iowa Public Policy Center. Tonight, we're going to be talking about food for thought, school meals, and student health. My name is Pete Damiano. I direct the Public Policy Center. And this event and others like this are part of our community engagement mission of the Public Policy Center to share the expertise of members of the center and others in the area with the public and policymakers. And I'm very pleased to introduce tonight Natoshia Askelson. Natoshia has been a part of the Public Policy Center for a couple of years, first as a student, then as a research staff, and now she is assistant professor in the College of Public Health, as well as has a joint appointment with the Public Policy Center. And Natoshia is a great example of the kind of applied research that we like to have go on at the University of Iowa. And she's an expert in food security issues and school issues. And she's going to be introducing our panel and having a great discussion with you tonight. So, Natoshia.
Thank you. So thanks so much for coming this evening. As Pete said, my name is Natoshia Askelson. I'm a faculty member in the College of Public Health and at the Public Policy Center. Just tell you a little bit about how this evening is going to work. I'm going to give you a brief introduction of kind of the school meal program, just so kind of we're all on the same page, the history of it, the nuts and bolts. Ooh. And then I'm going to have the panel speak. We have David Frisvold, who's an economist, Debbie Klein, who's a food service director, Brandi Janssen, who's an anthropologist, and Patrick Brady, who's a PhD student in the College of Public Health. And then I'm going to ask the panel some questions after they've told you about their work, and then we'll open it up to you all to ask your questions. So just to start the evening off, I'm glad you all were able to find a seat. So if we had done this a while ago, maybe a few years ago, this place might be packed and you would have trouble getting a seat. But just with a show of hands, how many of you were hot lunch eaters in school? And what was your favorite hot lunch? Mac and cheese. Mac and cheese? Pizza. Pizza. Was it the round kind or square kind or triangle kind? Square. Square. What else? Little Smokies with the mac and cheese? And the green beans or in wedges? Okay, so that is like a preview of the story to come. So what about school breakfast? How many of you lived in a day when school breakfast was served at your school? And very few, right? And did you eat school breakfast?
A few years, yes.
And what did you eat?
Mostly dipping sticks, like cinnamon toast dipping sticks. I would always get those.
All right.
Yep, all of them.
All right. All right. So that kind of gets you back in that mindset of thinking about school meals and tasting school meals. And so I'm going to take you back even further and to think about kind of how the school meal program started. So thinking like 1850s, early 1900s. So you can read accounts of people recognizing that kids were coming to school sick, hungry, malnourished. There are these accounts of kids in Cleveland, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, kind of all of our urban centers, whether it's priests or church leaders or teachers or nurses or kind of the do-gooders and social crusaders of the time, kind of talking about these poor urchins that were coming to school, that were hungry, that were starving. What are we going to do about it? And so slowly across the country, efforts started to feed kids. And these were usually kind of community-based efforts. They were often like the Ladies' Aid Society would do something, or a church would do something, or a synagogue would do something. Usually it wasn't something that the school had started. So it was an outside entity that decided they were going to feed kids. And they would, make soup or sandwiches or something that would feed a lot of kids. And maybe they'd have a way for kids to start to pay for things, but often it was just free food for kids that really needed food. And in rural schools, it was very different, right? We all read Laura Ingalls Wilder. You had your metal pail, and they brought, you brought your food from home. And there were some efforts to try to get like cooking happening as a group in rural schools, but it just wasn't as easy to do. So then the Depression happened, and that kind of situation became really acute. States then started noticing that they had to take action. And so some states started to fund school meal programs. And it wasn't long before there was a recognition that federal money was needed. And so really early on, when federal aid was being used to fight the Depression, even like WPA programs were feeding kids. But these weren't big federal programs. These weren't nationwide programs. These were just little programs happening across the country. But this is also the time when commodities got intertwined with schools. So the federal government was interested in keeping prices high for farmers, and we needed to feed kids. So there were two problems that we could solve by fixing that. And it wasn't until 1946 that we actually got what we call the National School Lunch Act, where we'd actually see kind of our modern day school lunch program, which is in the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, which most people don't realize. They think it's actually in the Department of Education. So this is where the mac and cheese story comes in. So I started kindergarten in 1978 in Helen Lemmy Elementary here. And when I was in first grade, my favorite lunch was mac and cheese, little smokies, green beans, orange wedges, and cinnamon rolls, right? And my son started kindergarten in 2003 at the same elementary school. And what was his favorite lunch? The exact same thing. And I wasn't doing research in school meals at the time. I was actually interested in a kind of adolescent risk behavior. But I thought, it can't be that 25 years later, we're still serving the same thing. I mean, I'm not serving the same thing to my kid that my mom served to me, and my mom isn't even serving the same thing to my kid that she served to me. So what's happened here? And so that kind of stuck with me. But what did happen is in 2008, the USDA turned to the Institute of Medicine and said, okay, so we've had the 4 food groups. Everyone remembers the 4 food groups. Who remembers the pyramid? The food pyramid, right? And then now we have my plate. But the USDA turned to the Institute of Medicine and said, we've had all these dietary guideline changes, but we haven't changed school meal requirements. Give us some guidance. And so from that came the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010, which then became nutrition standards that changed in school meals in 2012. And you can see here, these are really the changes that actually happened in school meals. So we got more whole grains, we got more choices around fruits and vegetables, larger portions of fruits and vegetables. We got legumes or meat alternatives added, more dark green, red, orange vegetables, and less fat and sodium. So if you're a student in Iowa schools, you often encounter a sign that looks like this when you're in the lunch line, and it's supposed to help you understand what you need to put on your tray so that you can get out of the lunch line. We've done quite a bit of work to try to understand how these changes happened and how schools dealt with them and how parents dealt with them and how kids dealt with them. And there have been a great number of myths, and I'm sure many of you will remember kind of the hubbub and the media hype that was around the changes. And some of the kind of myths that still are out there is that kids aren't getting enough calories, they're not getting enough food. When in fact we know they're getting 1/3 of the calories that they need for the day at lunch. It's a school meal. And in some places, they're able to get unlimited fruits and vegetables. So the thought that they might not be getting enough food is that maybe they're not taking the food that's being offered to them. Schools are only serving prepackaged food. I mean, it's true that many schools have had to change the way their kitchens operate, that they've lost space, they've lost labor, they've lost equipment. But schools are serving a lot more fresh fruits and vegetables than they ever have. And we're seeing a lot more schools returning to scratch. School food isn't healthy. And I think some of that is kind of our fault about not communicating what school food really is. So parents see pizza, they see hamburger, they see burrito, they see chocolate milk on the menu, and they know, I'm smart, those things aren't nutritious. but they don't know the pizza's whole grain, it's low-fat cheese, it's turkey sausage, maybe we've even like put in some other vegetable in the pizza. The burrito might have a yam in it, or black beans, whole wheat tortilla. The chocolate milk is not the chocolate milk you buy at Hy-Vee. It's got less sugar and less fat in it. So we're using the same words to communicate with parents, but it's not the same items, so that's confusing for parents. And parents believe that kind of the money that they're paying for their meal covers the actual cost of the meal. And I'll show you some information about that in a little bit. But related to that, they also believe that it's cheaper to bring a meal from home. And so there's been a lot of work done on that, looking at, how do you, if you take a nutritionally equivalent meal from home, what's that going to cost you? So if a school meal costs about $2.12 and you want to make a nutritionally equivalent meal from home, it's going to be over $3. So it's not really cheaper to bring that meal from home. So the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act has been around for a while, and what we can see is that the vast majority of schools have made the changes. There are very few schools who haven't met the requirements. The kids are accepting the changes, and parents are kind of going along with it too. And we have seen in a number of studies that kids are actually selecting and consuming more fruits and vegetables. So just to give you an idea of the scale of what we're talking about for a program, this program serves 31 million kids a day at lunch. I mean, it's like the biggest massive restaurant in the world. 14 million kids get breakfast out of this program, and we're talking about 98,000 schools. So this is the part where people are usually very surprised. So this is what the USDA pays schools for meals. So if a kid comes to school and they qualify for free breakfast, the USDA is going to give them $1.75. If the kid comes to school and they don't qualify for free and reduced breakfast and they pay full price for breakfast, the USDA is going to give the school 30 cents. Parents forget that the USDA is subsidizing everybody's meals when it comes to breakfast and lunch at school. So a kid who shows up for lunch, whether they're getting free, reduced, or they're paying full price, some of that money is coming from the federal government. So now we're going to turn to our experts. Our first expert is going to be David Frisvold. And David neglected to give me his bio, so I told him I'd make something up. David is an associate professor in the Department of Economics, which is true, with an appointment in the Public Policy Center. David's work explores the role of government policies to enhance education and health outcomes, with an emphasis on policies targeted towards low-income children. His research examines three themes: understanding whether and how public investments in disadvantaged children improve health and education outcomes, examining the influence of public policies on obesity, and understanding the relationship between education and health. Prior to coming to Iowa, he was a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar in Health Policy Research at the University of Michigan and assistant professor in the Department of Economics at Emory University. Go ahead, David.
All right, thanks. All right, so with school meals, right? So basically, I'm going to just talk a little bit about kind of the value of school meals and effectively what we get out of school meals. The school breakfast program is about a $3 billion a year program, and the school lunch program is about a $12 billion a year program. And so the question then is kind of how does this influence kids' outcomes? And so we have more work on the breakfast program that's a little bit more convincing than the lunch program. And really, I think it goes into thinking about a few different policies that have happened over time. And so one thing to think about is that school lunch program is in almost every school. and has been for quite some time, right? So it's been in at least 95% of schools for the last 50 years. That's not been the case for breakfast. So breakfast is a much newer program. It started in the mid-60s as a pilot program and has ramped up significantly since then. Nowadays, the school of breakfast program is in about 90% of schools. But that's actually pretty recent, right? So the first kind of policy lever to think about is the introduction of breakfast into the school system. And so when President Johnson launched the pilot program for the school breakfast program, his quote was "Good nutrition is essential to good learning." So we didn't necessarily have a great sense of if the school breakfast program delivered on that. So there's been a lot of work on nutrition, right? And so had the school breakfast program improved nutrition outcomes for kids? And the answer to that had been yes. It was enhancing the nutritional quality of what kids were eating. And some of the work that I've done has shown that that's also improving their academic achievement throughout elementary school. And so most of the results are going to actually happen for elementary school students because that's where participation in the program is much higher. And that can be for a handful of reasons. The participation is in the school meal programs is going to be higher as younger ages than older ages, and some of that can just be simply due to things like stigma. The school breakfast program, though, is a little bit more complicated in terms of thinking through how it operates because, so the school lunch program, basically all you have to have is a cafeteria. And then for schools, it's in their best interest really to participate in the National School Lunch Program. But for the breakfast program, you have to think about transportation because it can be before school. And so you, bless you. No, you may not want to have multiple. If you're going to have multiple times that the buses are going to run, that's quite expensive, right? So if you offer the buses early, then everybody gets there early. Or if you offer the buses late, then you're offering breakfast program, but then you're not giving students a way to actually get to the schools to participate. So one of the things that a lot of schools have done is move to things like breakfast in the classroom. So that's kind of the latest policy to try to enhance or try to increase participation. And a lot of work has shown that it significantly increases participation in the program. So the first policy lever is introducing the breakfast program. Of course, that's going to significantly increase participation in the program. And we see improvements in academic outcomes, improvements in nutrition, reductions in food insecurity. Breakfast in the classroom, we see improvements in academic outcomes, mixed to really not much of an impact on obesity. And increases in participation. And the obesity concern there is basically, are some kids getting multiple meals, or is it the case that kids are now eating earlier? So that is going to basically enhance their metabolism, and are they going to then lead to a reduction in obesity? We don't really see a whole lot in the literature on that. So that's kind of the school breakfast program. And so what I would say is related to nutrition and what kids are eating, really what it comes down to for both the breakfast program and the lunch program is what would kids have eaten in the absence of the program existing, right? So we might, think of the food and think, oh, maybe that's, maybe you have an impression of maybe it's not the most nutritious. Well, the question is not necessarily, is that the most nutritious it could be? The question really is it more nutritious than the opportunities would have been if the program did not exist, right? And so that's kind of the difficulty, is you have to figure out what would kids have been doing in the absence of the program. And so the program's improved outcomes. Of course, as a result of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, it could improve outcomes even more. And so then the National School Lunch Program really, it's a question of, it's a little bit harder to think of what would kids be doing in the absence of the National School Lunch Program because it's been so universal for so long. But it really comes down to then bringing your own lunch to school. It's a little bit harder question to really answer that well because it is such a different group of kids that bring their own lunch to school than eat lunch through the National School Lunch Program. I would say some of the most convincing work that I've seen on this finds that before the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, it was actually leading to an increase in total calories consumed and potentially responsible for a slight increase in obesity. And that is no longer the case following the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. So we see basically improvements over time. And so that just kind of gives you a big, broad sense of kind of what we've seen in terms of how these meal programs have been impacting kids' outcomes.
Thank you, David. Now we're going to move to Debbie Klein to give you kind of more of a on-the-ground look. So Debbie Klein is the School Food and Nutrition Director at Creek-Amana schools. Creek-Amana is her third school district serving as food service director, and she has almost 10 years experience as the school food service. Currently, she serves as a board member in the School Nutrition Association of Iowa. And in the last 3 years at Creek-Amana, her district has participated in the Farm to School program and has recently been selected as one of the 10 schools in the state to participate in the Farm to School procurement project hosted by ISU Extension and Outreach local foods teams. Last year, one Creek-Amana school participated in the school meal waste assessment pilot project working with a member of the Iowa Waste Exchange, and one elementary building now is involved in collecting school meal waste for use in composting. And last year, Patrick and I had the privilege of working with Debbie and her staff and kids through the Iowa Department of Education Team Nutrition Grant, a project that involved students interacting with school food service staff working together to make positive changes in the middle school cafeteria. And when she isn't working, she's spending time with her husband and her 5 children and her 10 grandchildren. And then a little secret, she used to be a dispatcher here for Johnson County. So if you ever called 911, you might have had the privilege of talking to Debbie.
Hope it was good. Well, thank you. I want to talk to you a little bit more in depth on the school level and the challenges we face for all school food service staff in the state of Iowa. There's a lot to consider with these challenges, one of them being budget. Not too many people in our parent environment, the general public, they're not aware that school food service programs are self-funded. We are not supported by general funds in the school district. In fact, we cannot use any of those general funds in the school district to help us if we have any indebtedness or expenses that come up. We have to be self-sufficient. With that, we have our monies coming in from, as Natoshia explained, government funding. We have parents that are paying for the students' meals. And in our district, in our middle school and high school levels, we have an a la carte program that provides nutritious snacks for students that they can purchase before and after school or during the lunchtime. We sell them right in the cafeteria. And these meet the smart snack guidelines that you may have heard about. And for the students that maybe don't like an item on the menu, or they need a little bit of something, or they want to buy a snack for when they have some sports practice after school, and they can purchase that during lunch. That is all also funding that helps us support our program. The expenses out of our program, of course, are those that you can easily identify with the cost of the food that you're purchasing, the cost of equipment when you need to buy it, when, old Bessie, that oven is never going to make it again and you need to get a new one. Our staff's salaries. We also have in our budget to incur some of the expenses of the school with their utilities, the water, the electricity, and so forth. We have to cover a percentage of that cost as well in each of our buildings. For Clear Creek-Amana, we have 6 school buildings. We will be breaking ground soon for the 7th one to be built. We have a very fast-growing school district, and we are very fortunate on that. I go to conferences and hear about many school districts having to close down a school because of low enrollment. So we're very fortunate on that. And we're very fortunate that each of our buildings has their own kitchen. We do not satellite any meals. That, to me, is very important, and that's something that was started before I came, and I'm glad I have the support of the district to be able to continue to do that, because I feel it gives us a better quality meal for the students, and not every student at every grade level likes the same thing, so that helps. With that, the next challenge is meeting students' taste on what they like, what they don't like. And this has been with the new changes, changing everything to whole grain, low fat. It's something that isn't practiced as much at home with some families. And so when they come to school, that whole grain tastes a little bit different to them. And some younger students may not be exposed to some of those food products that they can't identify with. We had an example of one school building, we served cantaloupe as part of our fresh produce. Every day we have something that is a fresh fruit or vegetable that's being served. And they looked at a piece of cantaloupe and didn't know what it was and had to ask the staff what it was, something they never had at home. So part of our serving of the lunch meals is also an education to those students to help them, oh, I know what that is now. It's a piece of cantaloupe. Or today we tried a radish, at school lunch. Sometimes we'll do that in order to just experiment with their taste, let them know what the product is that they're going to be having for their school meal. And we don't always meet every student. Out of 2,500 students, we don't meet all their likes. There's going to be food that they don't like. One of the things that we help as part of that nutrition education for them is that we will do taste testings in our school. We're lucky enough to have distributors and vendors that will provide us maybe with a case of some type of food that is new, just coming out on the market for us to be able to purchase. Try these with your students. So we will organize a taste testing. We will have, depending on the grade level, areas for them to mark down if they like it, yes or no, or what they did or didn't like about it. And that helps us a lot. That lets us know what they like. Because if I go to a food show and I try it and I like it, my tastes are way different than some third grader student that, tastes it and it's like, oh, that's awful. One of the things in the state of Iowa that I was just talking about earlier is that one of our government commodities that we will receive to help us with our food that we serve in our school meals is next year we're having hummus. And I told maybe I should say it's dip, and maybe they'll try it instead of saying it's hummus. Whatever it takes, to get them to try it. But that is a new food product that I'm excited to be able to provide to them, something new and different that meets our healthy standards. So we have the taste test and different pilot programs that we'll be involved with in students to help get the information from them, let them tell us what they like, and that will help us to know what to serve. And if we try a new recipe, they don't like it, they'll be bringing cold lunch that day and your numbers will be way down and you know that I'm not serving that one again. Excuse me. Time is another challenge. You mentioned a lot of the programs that I've been involved with in Farm to School and the school meal waste study that we were involved in. All of that takes time. And if I have a staff member that is sick for the day and we can't get a sub in, I'm cook, bottle washer, and I've got to also keep up with the rest of my duties. So time is a real challenge. And even for our cooks in the kitchens, they're coming in, making breakfast, serving it, cleaning up. They're starting in with lunch production at an early time because they're going to have 400 students coming in at 11 o'clock, and you're feeding 400 students in an hour and a half and getting them through the school line or the lunch line to be able to get their meals and have enough time to be able to eat. So time is a big challenge, no matter what role we're playing in the school food service program. It's always hard to meet your obligations that you need to each day. Pleasing the parents. You have to please the students to get them to eat, but pleasing the parents is another big challenge of ours. When you're talking money, people feel entitlement. You're putting out something, you want something back in return. That's just common for anything that you do. The entitlement of, I'm putting forth my money, or I'm paying taxes, my taxes are paying for school meals, you still have that conversation of, you owe me. When it comes to children, your own children, you are very protective of them. So you want to make sure that they're not coming home and crying about what happened in school lunch for the day. You don't want it to be a bad experience for them. You want it so that you're planning a menu that you're going to have most of the students like. They may not like everything on that tray, but there's going to be something there that they will eat to help them through to get the nutrition that they need, and they're not going to come home with, big hunger pains of, I didn't eat anything for lunch today. Many of those parent challenges also are the lack of knowing what we do for our programs, what we do for our students. There are so many regulations out there, I can hardly keep up. We have Department of Education that gives us some of our regulations. We have USDA. We have a lot of resources that are coming to us saying, this is what you need to do. As a parent, that's not high priority for me to sit there and know all that. As an employee, yes. In the role that I play, yes. But as a parent, I'm not going to take the time to sit there and read the food code from 2013 to know what needs to be happening. So a lot of that challenge is just to keep open communication with parents. I have on our school website a food nutrition page, so parents can go to that, get some questions answered. The nutrition analysis for all of our school menus are put on there as well, so they can look at that to know how many calories are you feeding my child during this lunch or breakfast meal. My contact information is on there so that I'm constantly getting phone calls or emails from parents that do have questions about a certain food product, or how can you accommodate my student with a food allergy, so forth. So we try to do what we can ahead of time to combat some of those challenges that we have with parents, to provide them as much information as we can, and hence another reason of being here today. One of the things that we also do for parents to help them, and I'm so glad you guys brought this up, I had it written down, is the comfort foods that you had for school meals when you were growing up. The mac and cheese and the little Smokies, that was always a favorite too when I was growing up and when I first started in school food service. Well, when I started, it was when my children were growing up, and then I did the dispatching for a while, and then I came back into school food service. And so I've seen a wave of when my kids were growing up, when I started, and where I'm at now, and the guidelines have changed so much, because my first staff of cooks was the little gray-haired ladies that were standing there rolling out the dough for the cinnamon rolls that were homemade, that you had one that, was the size of your plate, and those were awesome. So the chili and cinnamon roll menu, the little Smokies and mac and cheese, how can you bring those back today and still meet your guidelines? Get very creative. You modify your recipes so that you can get those to work with the calorie content, the fat content, and everything that you need. You need to get that so it's applicable today and what you need to meet your guidelines with. The mac and cheese, maybe you change that to a whole grain pasta so that you're getting what you need to and meet your requirements, but yet you can still provide that comfort meal to them. The cinnamon roll has gone down, unfortunately, to about this size. and it's made with whole grain flour instead of what we used to have years ago. But we're putting it on that menu so that when you're reading that menu, you're saying, oh, chili and cinnamon roll, that's awesome. You know, I had that when I was there for school lunch. So we have to market what we're menuing as well. And when the parents are seeing that, I'm not packing you a cold lunch, you're having my favorite meal. You know, you do that so that you're pleasing the parents as well. And so that helps your challenges with them. And that was one thing I did when I started at Clear Creek 3 years ago. I'm like, I gotta get those recipes in there. So those are kind of an outline of some of the challenges, and we have a lot of challenges every day with new things that, oh, I've never heard of that one, and those will keep going. And but as long as we keep our parents and our students and even our teaching staff at the school all informed of what we are doing as much as we can, and we have to promote what we're doing as well, then I think that helps us along.
Thank you, Debbie. Brandi Janssen is up next. Dr. Janssen is an anthropologist and a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Occupational and Environmental Health at the University of Iowa. She has researched local food systems and alternative agriculture in Iowa since 2008 and is author of the book Making Local Food Work: The Challenges and Opportunities of Today's Small Farmers. I would urge you all to go buy it. I've read it. It's a great book. Available at Prairie Lights.
It is. I was not even.
She's past president of Field to Family and helped found the Iowa City Community School District's Farm to School program.
Yeah, so I always love to hear the stories of what really happens in the kitchen, which when I got involved in Farm to School, it stemmed initially from my work in local food systems. So I wasn't really thinking about institutional food so much. I was thinking more about what's going on farms and how is this sort of, burgeoning local food movement working around the state. And what people were really talking a lot is what, in part it was about farmers markets and CSAs, community supported agriculture and these kind of arrangements. But then it was also about finding ways to make local food more consistently available to bigger portions of the population. And so institutional food then becomes the topic, right? How do we get local food in schools and hospitals and care facilities, et cetera? And so it's often, farm to school programs are very popular. They have a lot of buy-in at the community level, from my experience, and they're often kind of touted as this new model. However, not unlike the original school lunch program, where the goal was to create markets for farmers by developing feeding programs in schools, that's exactly what Farm to School does. It creates market for farmers by developing feeding programs in schools. It's sort of the exact same model. It hasn't changed at all. It's just a slightly different set of farmers and presumably somewhat different food. And that's somewhat debatable because there's a lot of fresh food in school food anyway. But for a small-scale farmer, it's an exciting opportunity to maybe have a consistent market and to scale up their production a little bit. So in 2010, 2011, the Farm to School program here in the Iowa City Community School District started. And so there are over 20 schools in the district with only 5 kitchens. To hear that you have a kitchen in every school, it's like, as a parent, when all of the conversations about building new schools in the district came up, every survey I said, put a kitchen in the school, put a kitchen in the school. I don't think they listened to me, but it makes a huge difference in how you can feed kids, because there are very complicated delivery routes for all the food that gets moved around the district. And in fact, it resulted in the food service department staying down behind Paul's Discount and Finn and Feather, as opposed to moving up to North Dodge, simply because of those delivery routes were so complicated. So it's a whole nother topic, I think. But so Farm to School sort of in some ways dovetails really nicely with the school lunch program, and then in some ways it's a little less complementary, I guess, from my experience. And the ways that it is beneficial certainly are with parent pleasing, we found in Iowa City. I can't speak for every district in the state, but it certainly got a lot of goodwill from parents. And I know the food service director at the time saw it that way too. She was excellent to work with, and was very receptive to trying a lot of things out, even though she's getting food around to 25 schools out of 5 kitchens and, paying at the top of her labor budget and all of those things. And some of that was that, it's a good PR for a school in some contexts, especially at a time when the attention to school lunch was really negative. So this was a real positive thing that she felt she could do for the district's, public view of the district. And in the other ways, it sort of dovetails in these little ways. For example, the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act has moved to a sort of color, I think this is still the case, the color-based, you serve so many red vegetables, green, orange, you have to get all your colors in the week. And this works pretty well, except here, orange was a real problem. I don't know if orange is a problem for you, but the orange vegetables, we were like, they were sort of, you could get these frozen sweet potato puff things, or you could do carrots, and everybody gets sick of carrots. And so we wound up finding a way to source local sweet potatoes, and those actually worked really well. And it was kind of a surprise, and with a little butter and cinnamon and some sugar, the kids actually ate their sweet potatoes pretty well in the Iowa City Community School District, and we filled the orange vegetable requirement, so that was the win there. So in some ways, farm to school can really dovetail nicely. In other ways, it's really challenging. And some of those you alluded to, Debbie, time and preparation. So one of our first out-of-the-gate attempts for a local side in the school lunch meal was a salad, because we thought, that's easy, right? You can do salad. And we learned so much in that experience. First being, do local farmers have enough supply to feed 12,000 servings of salad? So we had to piece it together from multiple suppliers. The weather doesn't always cooperate here in Iowa, so we're trying to get a school meal in before the end of the school year. I mean, it's cold right now, so I would be worried if I were trying to serve fresh lettuce by the end of May, because a cold spring can, undermine you have these tiny little lettuce heads, and they're not going to go very far. The other issue was quantity. So if you're a food service director, you're used to purchasing cut, bagged spinach or lettuce by the pound. And if you're a local farmer, you're probably selling your lettuce by the head. So in February, we were trying to calculate how big would those lettuce heads be, and how much lettuce will you get out of each one, and how many do we need to make the 325 pounds of lettuce that we are going to need for this meal before they've even sprouted. So even how farmers and food service directors talk about supply is very different. So much of our process became about trying to figure out where we could find points of commonality between what the food service director needs and what the farmer needs. And quantity is a piece of that. I remember a farmer once asking at a farm to school event, well, why are you so concerned about the size of my apples, right? So apples come in a crate. It's like you get 113 count apples. That's how many apples are in the 50-pound box. And the farmer's like, I don't sort my apples in this way. What is the deal? And the food service director says, I have to serve a particular quantity of apple to every kid. And that means I need to know how big the apple is. That's how I do it. And for the farmers who we've trained to sell at farmers markets and they show off their oddly shaped, weird apples, the food service director is like, I cannot deal with that in my kitchen. That does not work for me. So finding ways to make these, when we develop a local food system that's based on the interesting and the heirloom and the odd shaped and for an institutional kitchen that has a tight time and labor budget and needs to get things done, they don't have a lot of time to deal with the weirdly shaped cucumber or carrot that has 12 legs sticking out. So we learned a lot over time, and in some cases we found products that worked really well. The sweet potatoes are one example. Melons and cantaloupe are another that have worked really well in this district, and they're usually cheaper when you get them in season than they are from the U.S. Foods or the Martin Brothers or whoever the big distributors are. So there's some really clear wins, but we're still working on the kind of the level of sides here and there, right? So we have not gotten to the point of there being, the full local meal, at least in Iowa City. I don't know if you're having better luck in Clear Creek-Amana, but it's, it's the new old model. When we think of it as something new, it's not. It's the same idea. It's not a bad one, and maybe it increases some participation, get some goodwill in the community. It certainly can create markets for farmers. I mean, as someone who does work in agriculture, I think that's a key piece of it, but it's not to be, there are some difficulties and usually a reality check or two as programs are being implemented. So that's all.
Thank you. So next up is Patrick Brady. Patrick Brady is a graduate student at the College of Public Health and a research assistant with the Public Policy Center. Before coming to Iowa, he earned his master's degree in nutrition from the University of Maryland. His research interests are in the role of diet in preventing chronic disease and how we can design interventions to improve healthy eating habits without focusing on dieting. For the past 3 years, he's worked on a number of projects in school lunchrooms focusing on improving healthy eating.
So yeah, as Natasha mentioned before, we've worked for about 3 years with Team Nutrition, which is part of the Department of Education. And actually, we go into lunchrooms and try to get kids to eat better. We do this using kind of two main strategies. The first is behavioral economics-based changes. Behavioral economics is a relatively new field that takes psychology, marketing, classical economics, and tries to understand consumer behavior. So why do you choose an apple over a bag of chips when you're a fourth grade student going through the lunch line? So we can design the lunchroom to make that apple more attractive than the bag of chips. Not really based on taste, not really changing the food, but making it easier to grab, making the chips harder to grab. So if they have to ask a staff member for a bag of chips, some kids are just gonna grab that apple, get to the lunch table to talk to their friends. So there's a number of these strategies that we go to the schools and we work with students to identify what changes can be made to their lunchroom to promote food items we want them to eat. So the fruits, vegetables, white milk, water, anything not sugar sweetened beverage. Our second kind of strategy for really making this work is actively involving the students in identifying those changes. So this movement of using behavioral economics to improve school lunchrooms is pretty big. But a lot of times, they'll have somebody like me come in, check off this tool in the lunchroom, tell somebody, these are the changes you should make. And then, they make the changes and they say, well, we served more fruit, so this is great. But one thing we kind of noticed is if the students identify the changes, they're going to work a little better because they see the lunchroom different than an outside adult will. So I think one example is we were doing a lunchroom assessment and we said, is there white milk available? And they all said, no. And it was right there. They just weren't seeing it. We all checked off white milk's available in every cooler. I don't think any of the student groups did. So we want the students to really be the ones identifying those changes, implementing those changes, and kind of owning the intervention in their lunchroom to really make it better, hopefully make it more effective, and get kids eating more fruits and vegetables through these really, really easy, low-cost changes, because we don't want to put more stress on our food service directors and our food service staff who do face a lot of these challenges. So if we can just, say, add a bowl of fruit to your service line and move the chips to behind the counter, that's a really easy way. We're not adding a ton of work, and we can get kids to hopefully eat more fruit.
Thank you, Patrick. So I've got a few questions, and then we can open it up for questions you all might have. So some school districts are privatizing their food service, either partially by like having Domino's Pizza be their pizza that they offer, or maybe like some kind of Subway sandwiches, or entirely like having Aramark come in and actually just do the entire lunch. What do you all think about that? What are the implications for students, for the program, for funding?
One of the things that I did when I first started was I heard through some of the student surveys or from other districts, well, we have such and such pizza coming into our lunchroom and we serve that every day to our students to come in. And these companies will aggressively solicit too. We can come in and take care of your lunch and so forth. And there was a pizza company that went to one of the local school districts here around Iowa City, and I met with her, the food service director, and talked to her about what did she think of that. She said she went under contract. It was inherited when she started at that school. It had already been a program in place for a few years. She said when she got there and she saw the driver coming in, personal hygiene was a huge issue for that driver coming in delivering the food. She went out and saw the vehicle he was driving and carrying these pizzas out of. The containers that they were being delivered in were dirty, filthy. So by contracting that out and saying, oh yeah, we're offering, this pizza to our students, you're giving them a huge problem with that food coming in and not meeting the criteria for what could be a safety issue with having safe food coming in. I wasn't about to look at that. I'm like, there's a lot of companies out there that are trying to sell us through our distributor food that meets our requirements. Pizza's pizza for kids. They like it. It was just a matter of finding, which brand they wanted and which one they liked, and you do the taste testing. But for us to go outside and to bring that in and have that quality go down compared to what we could do ourselves, it was a no-brainer. So it's something to consider.
I think you also miss out on, I like that there are local people working in the kitchens that in our district, and so presumably you're eliminating some local level jobs if that labor for preparation goes away. And as you pointed out, Debbie, the school food service are there. You're a self-funded operation, but you're not a for-profit operation. Correct. So, and Aramark is. So when you think about what the goals of those two types of organizations are, and it's that it's our kids who are being fed, I think that's another consideration.
So I guess I'd just throw out, my understanding is it's not as much an issue in the local area. Some of the school food service directors that I've talked to, basically what they've said is what happens is if you can't make your budget, then what happens is like a Aramark or a Sodexo will come in, the district will contract with them if the school food service is basically not able to make their budget. So that's the alternative that happens.
So there's going to be a new farm bill, we hope. What will the new farm bill mean for school meals? What changes might we see? Changes in nutrition requirements, changes in the funding? David, can you forecast that one for us?
Yeah, so, on the funding side, it's somewhat, so it's interesting, in the sense of, just hearing some talk of like what some of, different food service directors or advocates thought was going to change with funding, and how the reimbursement rate was going to change when the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act came in. People were like, oh, maybe we can get like $2. It was a change of 6 cents. I'd say be
It was exciting. That was an exciting sequence.
Right. No, and people were like, this is the biggest change we've ever seen. Right. So keep expectations modest if you think it's going to be positive, and don't be surprised if it's negative. So I'd say one of the things that so I was on this panel that was convened by the USDA for a while, that was about maybe 2 years ago. And one of the things that they were really concerned about, and this came out of the House, was the concern about erroneous payments. And so, their concern was about basically, is there funds that are being distributed to schools that are erroneous, and it can go multiple ways, but primarily it's getting funding for kids that were not eligible to have gotten free meals. And so I would not be surprised if there is something that's introduced at some point in the near future to try to address erroneous payments. This panel at the time was more focus on measurement, and the House was pretty interested in that. I wouldn't be surprised if there are changes to the eligibility process that comes along at some point soon. I mean, we've been seeing that quite a bit lately. Now there's direct certification, so not everyone has to fill out the paper forms that you used to fill out. So if my household receives benefits through the SNAP program, which used to be called food stamps, then my children could be automatically enrolled into the free status instead of me having to fill out the application. So that's direct certification. You might see some changes to community eligibility provisions. I would not be surprised if instead of it expanding in the next Farm Bill, it actually starts to shrink. Community eligibility provision is basically an attempt to try to reduce administrative costs of the program. And so if 40% of the school is eligible for free meals, then you don't have to fill out the paperwork, and you can just have free meals for the entire school. Generally speaking, the school doesn't break even until you hit the 60% mark, but you can opt into the program at 40%. I wouldn't be surprised to see that threshold change in the next Farm Bill.
Anyone else willing to predict?
We'll see if we get one. Every 5 years, and it usually takes, 7 or some, it's always a little bit of a juggle. But, there's always tension between the agricultural interest in the Farm Bill and the food interest in the Farm Bill. And that's for a reason. It's in part to make sure that urban lawmakers are engaged in the conversation. So there is a rationale for that, but it also sometimes just turns it into kind of a big fist fight. What you're saying seems like a pretty likely process, and I would say if there are concessions, I feel like agriculture is going to be more likely to win in this Farm Bill than food programs. That's my sense.
And I would also throw, I don't know if we will necessarily hear as much in the media about changes in the Farm Bill related to school meal programs. I expect the conversation about SNAP will dominate. So, in terms of what the focus, people's focus and legislators' focus is going to be on the SNAP program more so.
So are there questions from the audience?
Okay, so I think I'm on. Yeah, so this is live on the public library channel. So for that reason, I want to capture your questions on the mic so the whole world can hear your questions. And can I start?
Yes.
Okay. I just wonder if you have any challenges or have to make any adjustments based on current nutritional or diet trends. For example, this year is low-fat, whole grain. Next year is high protein, no carb. The year after that is paleo. Your own personal feelings on that?
We've seen high increase in gluten-free. We have many young children that I believe in fact do have the gluten-free allergies, but there's also parents that are coming in and asking for a gluten-free diet for their child, making the assumption that's what they need. And luckily, our requirements are that if we're going to modify the diet and buy the gluten-free products, then we are going to have this substantiate by this form filled out and signed by your doctor, and have that doctor say, this is what you need to feed this child because of these allergies. So it's changed now where you just can't come in and say, I demand you to feed this to my child. It's gotten a little more regulated so that we have a little more backup as to somebody in the medical profession looking at what we're trying to feed kids and meet their requirements with those food allergies. But gluten-free is a big one out there now. And we still have parents that'll come through and say, well, vegan is another one that is popular out there. And we had a conflict with a parent that just said that we're eating vegan at home and I would like you to honor that, for my child here as well. They're probably going to bring cold lunch often, bring that from home instead of having the school lunch. Well, many times a student brought the lunch from home. Student didn't want to be vegan and eat vegan. Student was going through the lunch line eating what all of the other students were eating, and then, of course, the parent wasn't paying for these lunches, not knowing that charges were accumulating because that child didn't want to eat it. So, yeah, there's fads that go along with that as well.
Thank you. Great program. Thanks for having it. I'm Mike Carberry, Chair of the Johnson County Board of Supervisors, and one of our strategic priorities has been local foods, and really love seeing the programs to get the local and fresh foods into the school meals. But there's a couple problems I see of it. One is seasonality. School ends sometime around Memorial Day, a little after, and that's just at the beginning of the growing season, and then it starts kind of at the end of the growing season. So the opportunity, unless you have greenhouses, is possibly to get that local fresh food into the school meals. So I'd like to address that. And then the other would be about the number of meals that you serve a day. And you are massive amounts, and whether you use food hubs or you see the need for them. We just, I believe, budgeted close to $90,000 to the Iowa Valley Food Hub. So we can create a food hub here in Johnson County that doesn't have to be run by the county. So a food hub is basically a consolidator that can serve industrial kitchens. And do you see the need for that? And when this is up and running, is that something that you will use?
So on the seasonality piece, yeah, certainly that's a challenge in Iowa. But most schools do have at least some feeding programs through the summer. So there's, and for a lot of districts getting into farm to school programs, that's a great place to start because there are fewer kids. So it's a good way to kind of trial run some of those. Greenhouses and winter production are one option, but so is a focus on winter storage. So one of the reasons that sweet potatoes worked well is that they store. So you can still buy them in January, and they just came out of the ground a few months ago. So focusing on, there are lots of carrot varieties that will store over winter as well. So there are some ways that you can, think about not just production in the winter, but storage. When I was working more closely with Farm to School here, we also talked a bit about preservation, either freezing, buying berries in season and freezing. That became challenging largely because of space constraints at the school. So when you've got a school freezer, you need to turn over that inventory that's in there. You can't have things sitting around. So it was also hard because if you're going to freeze things, you need a freezer that freezes quickly, not a freezer that's made to hold things to follow your food safety rules. So there are options. There's sort of challenges, but also options with preserving and storing food. I think thinking about greenhouses and even high tunnels that don't require power can extend your season quite a bit, and you can get fresh things out of those as well. I think the food hubs and supply, I think, can be a good idea if it works for farmers. So, when you start, one thing that local food farmers like is the direct market relationship, which means that they capture all of the pieces of that, of their profit margin. And so when you start aggregating, as long as it's fair for the farmers who are involved, maybe a cooperative setup or something along those lines, I think it can work well. And it can certainly do a lot to increase the supply, which is definitely a challenge. I know that across Iowa there are attempts to kind of develop essentially contracts. So, if a food service director can sit down with a farmer, or maybe a food hub manager even in the spring, and say, here's maybe what I'll need, and have farmers plant for that. It's been hard. It's kind of a little standoff in that food service directors are often a little hesitant to get involved in contracts if they don't feel certain that they're going to get that supply, because things do happen. And farmers are a little nervous about going into these relationships because they're not sure will that will that buyer really be there on the other end, or will the food service director really be able to forecast out their meals that far? And so there's been kind of a little, it's kind of a chicken or an egg. Somebody's going to need to make a step and move forward. But a food hub might be a solution to that too, if you think about that supply. Others' thoughts on that? But.
She said a lot of good information, and I think, with that, a food hub, would be beneficial with those parameters. And it's certainly something that I have not experienced or had the experience with. We've gone with Farm to School on some local producers, that are within the community here that we can easily go pick up ourselves, or because we're so close, it's nominal or no delivery fees, which keeps our costs down. So we utilize that, and through the pilot program that I just started that we're working towards for next school year on more farm to school participation in our district, I'd like to extend that out further than just the 2 suppliers that I've worked with that are local. So certainly if there was another resource, I think that would be beneficial to our schools.
Especially, but along with that comes packaging and delivery that works for you. So that's for whoever the school is. So I know that there are issues sometimes with deliveries being made in packaging that is not. My favorite story is the food service director who had to explain to the farmer why they couldn't deliver their green beans in a laundry basket, right? That there needs to be food grade delivery and and packaging and those sorts of things. So having a food hub, some of that, honestly, I think if you want to increase. There's the piece that I see missing is the light processing. Let's somebody invest in a light processing facility that will shred cabbage for coleslaw and will shred carrots so that you can get a local product, but that doesn't require a lot more labor either on the at the farm end or the school district end. But that's not, nobody wants to go run a food process. They all want to go be farmers now, and that's great. But somebody build the food processing plant.
And we have tried in some of our school breakfast work to get off a food processing group
piece
off the ground, and there is a local food processing outfit that does freezing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, slow but steady.
Mm-hmm.
So my question kind of talks about students who are getting the majority of their food from the school. So for instance, if you're getting breakfast and lunch, and then even in cases of poverty, those are your only meals for the day. How do you kind of work on the education side? You talked about how you offered cantaloupe, and a student had never seen cantaloupe, and now that's something that they can recognize and try. But you also spoke about how you're making healthier versions of unhealthy foods. So pizza is not innately healthy most places where you purchase it. But if you're feeding it every single week, students are being taught that this is a food that is for you to consume. So how do you kind of work on the education side of things where you're saying, oh, also we changed all of the different parts of the pizza to make it healthy. So if you went out into the grocery store and bought a frozen pizza, it's not going to be the same product, especially as students get older. So they're eating pizza and knowing that that's something that is okay for them to eat, but it's not the same pizza. You know what I'm saying?
Right, I do. One of our resources that we use to advertise our meals is on Facebook, on social media. And when we list the food items that we're having on the menu each day, we will identify it as this is whole grain, this 100% fruit juice. So, we're advertising it as that type of item on there. Also in the classroom for the students through Team Nutrition, which is through our Department of Education here in Iowa and USDA. It's a grant program that we have 2 people in Iowa that run that program, and we have an overabundance of teaching materials that we can take into the classroom for curriculum that when we do our taste testing, we will bring that in as well. And we will take those menu components or the components of the meal for that day, and we'll say, your whole grain is the crust in this pizza. And we'll identify those parts of the meal with them so they can know that, okay, this is what this product is, and so forth. I can say just like you identified the pizza, it's
a low-fat, skim cheese that's being used. Yes, there's other vegetables that are added into that sauce. It is turkey sausage, it's a whole grain crust. So those are just part of the requirements that we have to meet in the guidelines. We are required to have the different color vegetables each week and so forth. And we list that information on the Choose Your Plate thing that we had up here earlier. We list that before the students come into the cafeteria. We list the menu items on a dry erase board. And then we have signage next to each component of that meal that says this is your grain, this is your meat, this is your red, orange vegetable. So we do as much as we can to get that out there. And vocal. Our cooks are well-trained. They go through standards of training for their positions and have to have so many curriculum hours each year, and they're studying this as well. So if they have parents come right into the kitchen, parents don't have to come and ask me. They can go and talk to each one of the cooks, and they'll know that information as well. And that's happened before, too.
This question is probably more directly to Patrick, but you were talking about behavioral economics, and I was wondering if there was like a lot of pushback or any pushback in. I'm more familiar with like nutritional nudging, I guess that term for it, or even like where a student won't take the chips or the apple because the apple's there first. And I would assume that's something that's simpler for younger students to adapt to, and so is it like harder to get high schoolers than sixth graders or something like that?
So nudging is a big part of it, so that is one component we do like to use, whether it's the actual food service staff, saying, hey, you should take a vegetable, or hey, do you want to try this? It's new. So we do incorporate those nudges. As far as how well it works and kind of those other issues, with really little kids, these strategies might not actually be applicable because they're not making a choice as they're walking through the line. Every second grader has their tray. They get a scoop of this, scoop of this, scoop of this. And with high school students, we did a project, and they were more difficult than some of the younger kids when we were working in the middle schools like Clear Creek, because they were more set in their ways. They liked their bag of chips. They're not as malleable. So I think it is, important to kind of start building these habits young, and getting into schools, and just kind of the long-term goal of making these small changes and getting somebody to select fruit a couple more times a week is really to build that habit of eating more fruits and vegetables consistently from a young age, and hoping that carries, into high school, college, and adulthood. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I kind of went off on a tangent there. Okay.
Hi. So we've heard at various points that charter schools are a laboratory of innovation within the context of the school food system. Does that seem true or reasonable to you guys? Or can you point to examples of that happening? Or is it a fairy tale?
That's a good question.
That's the David question.
So, I mean, and most of the work I've done to keep it more, I don't know, easier, I tend to exclude charter schools or see how much they, they become such a small part of the sample that they don't really do much. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess I haven't seen a lot of discussion about charter schools innovating related to the meals. Now, I mean, one way I think you could see this would be if charter schools did things like introduce a culinary program in the high school. I would say, a culinary program that I saw that I thought was actually quite impressive was not in a charter school. It was in a regular school. So charter schools could do more of that, but I've actually seen traditional public schools that have had very nice culinary programs that really paid off for the district because of you have high school students that are doing a lot of the scratch cooking, and they're getting training as a result of that. So that could be one way charter schools would or could do something like that, but I haven't actually seen a lot of it. It's a great question. Charter schools could push on the meal programs more, but I haven't seen it. They're pushing in more, other aspects of the curriculum or other aspects of, not on the curriculum side, but other aspects of the requirements within the school day.
Hi, my name's Katie Broughton. I'm an assistant faculty member here at the university. So as Dave mentioned, the National School Lunch Program's been along for a long time, and Brandi mentioned there's lots of interested parties involved, and I imagine some of the ways in which it operates are just the result of legacy and how things have unfolded over time. So if you were able to redesign the program within similar resource constraints, what are some factors that are components you would want to be sure stayed and were part of the program, and what is something that you might want to change if you had the opportunity to think about how the program is run and operated?
It's a fun question.
I myself.
Yeah, you have to say first, actually.
I would like to see funding made available somehow so all kids are fed free. So it's not a financial burden for parents. There's no paperwork to fill out. It's just, you're going to school, you worry about your student going to school, learning. Lunch meals are not going to be a problem or an issue. My dream case, anyway, of what I would like to change. And to come up with some constructive way to find funding to make that happen, but it's still up here in a cloud.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Boy, that's a hard question. I'd have to put some thought into that, I think. I think things like the nutrition guidelines, I think, are good. I think there are other requirements. One that comes to mind are bid requirements. So, everything you buy as anybody who works for a public school, whether it's carrots or chairs, you have to put out for competitive bid. So working in the local food context, that becomes really challenging for food service directors who feel a little overwhelmed. They're like, I don't know 3 producers who grow broccoli. So, am I breaking the rules if I call 3 people and 2 of them don't have broccoli? Then do I still have to? They get kind of tangled up in the weeds, of those regulations. I would like to see those. And there are some. There's a geographic preference clause that theoretically allows some more flexibility, but they're still kind of burdensome for making the purchase. And there's a lot of tension between, at least in our state, between the Department of Ed and the Department of Ag and how those things lay out. And trying to alleviate some of those tensions would be really nice, I think.
Yeah, no, I think those are all great ideas. I think the enhancements to the nutritional standards were a nice step. Initially, you would see some pushback. But I think one of the things that can happen, especially as the nutritional standards become more adopted and widely accepted, particularly at younger ages, I think that will pay off quite a bit. I would say having better nutrition at as early as possible is going to pay off for a long time. This could be things like, we have school meals now that in some areas don't kick in until first grade, some areas are kicking in kindergarten, and tying some of the ideas of the school lunch and school breakfast program into the CACFP, the Child and Adult Care Food Program, I think to help have enhanced nutrition at an earlier age can pay off as well. So yeah, that's just kind of some quick thoughts. Yeah.
So, kind of going from the funding angle, one thing I think would be really nice is if kind of food service directors and food service staff had more funding, had more training options, they could retain staff better, and just be able to kind of build that relationship with the student body, and have more opportunities to do that. And they spend so much time in the kitchen because they have to get these meals out. But if you could hire more staff, if you could have them be kind of more involved with students, I think that could improve participation, especially in school meal programs, get more kids eating, the school meals, just because they know the lunch lady a bit better and they want to go say hi. So I think that's one way that's not really thinking about food, but a way to get more kids involved in the program.
So I would say also related to Debbie's idea, right? The administrative costs are not small, and so the eligibility criteria seem actually pretty easy, right? If your household income is below 130% of the federal poverty guidelines, then you're eligible for free meals. But you also can be directly certified if your household participates in a couple different programs. But it's not quite that easy. And it's a one sheet of paper, and you're trying to fill this out, and you're like, who's in my household? Oh, did I accidentally leave off some people in my household? The income period is not, it's not consistent across these different programs, and it's actually quite confusing sometimes to list your correct income to determine if you're eligible. And so there's a lot of, it can be sometimes more complicated than necessary for households, and some kids may not be eligible or may not apply just because of this complicated process. So streamlining the eligibility is I would say a really nice thing to do, and of course streamlining it to just get rid of that is going to be one way in terms of really reducing the administrative costs.
So I learned a lot of new things today. One is that LBJ started the breakfast program, and part of the Great Society, I'm sure, where we actually had something called the War on Poverty. And unfortunately in our country, it was probably started with Ronald Reagan, who considered ketchup a vegetable. And so is that now we have the war on the poor. And I've heard about something about lunch shaming, about people that can't afford their school lunch have their tray dumped out in front of them. I want to know, is that an urban legend? Does that exist? Does it happen here in Iowa? And then the most important one, do you consider ketchup a red vegetable?
Ketchup is not a red vegetable. We'll just put that right out there. In fact, ketchup can be limited in some schools. And we talked about lunch shaming at dinner. So Debbie, do you want to start on that one?
Unfortunately, yes, it has happened in Iowa. It was about a year ago that there was a newspaper article in our Cedar Rapids Gazette about a local school that had an incident that happened. And I think it got taken to the Josh Scheinblum, investigative report on TV as well. It's something that I don't know how often it happens. I'm sure there has been instances where something has happened. The media is going to take their sight of what they're looking at, whether it's the whole picture or not. There is some talk about it in Des Moines. Recently, I went to Des Moines to talk to legislators about something else that is being put forth on negative balance lunch accounts, and that school food services, when it comes to the end of the school year, should just wipe that out of their budget and start all over new, and they're not going to recoup that money, and it should not be tried to be collected. One school district in Iowa has a debt of $40,000 in their district for that. Looking at that, that's highly detrimental. You know, that could be 2 people's part-time jobs for the year that have to be eliminated in order to force out that debt. So we talked to legislators about how that is going to be hard for us. The same thing we're doing as part of the School Nutrition Association of Iowa. We have a legislative committee that is going to Des Moines and talking to them about the lunch shaming and saying, you know, most of us, for the most part, we're not doing this. This is not an issue for us. Not saying it's never been done, but it's not an issue for us. We all have procedures in place when it gets to negative balances on what we're going to do, how we're going to still provide a meal. And I know in my district, we're not going to not feed a student. We feed every student regardless of their lunch balance. So every student is going to have a meal. They're not going to get through the day if they're not going to have that. They're going to have the hunger pains taking over their day instead of what they're supposed to be learning, and we don't want that for them. But in turn, it's, you know, almost a full-time job to make sure we're doing those collection practices so we don't get that much in debt. And I'm probably one of the few districts, because I work on that a lot, that we're at a little over $1,000 in debt with our negative balances. So for our school district, you know, with 6 schools and that many students, and that's our only indebtedness, you know, for the negative balances on an average, I feel very lucky that, you know, we have a good group of people that are working on that at each building to make sure that we're not a $40,000 debt. And then legislation's going to change to make sure that we're never going to be able to collect on that and have to wipe it out. Because as I mentioned earlier, we cannot take funding from the general fund for the school district. We have to support ourselves. So, hope that
Thank you all
answered your
so
question.
much for coming. We're closing our evening, but you are welcome to stay away from the microphone. You are welcome to come up and talk to our panelists after we've officially closed. Thank you.
So please join me in thanking Professor Askelson and our panel for helping